Summary of A House for Mr Biswas by V.S.Naipaul. In A House for Mr Biswas, the main character, Mr Biswas, has a hard life from the time he is born in the country of Trinidad to the time he dies in the city of Port of Spain at the age of 46. He moves around a lot, has a bad marriage to Shama Tulsi, has bad kids, and makes bad financial decisions while trying to buy a house. Mr Biswas is a romantic, insatiable man who is prone to pride, failure, unrealistic optimism, and despair. Throughout his life, he has dreamed of finding financial stability and a home for his family. When he finally gets the house he's always wanted, it turns out to be a scam. The house is poorly built and almost impossible to live in, and Mr Biswas can't pay his debt. His health gets worse, and the sentinel fires him. He then has a heart attack and dies. In the introduction, Mr Biswas's story starts where it ends, with him being fired, being in debt, and living in a beautiful but falling apart house that he bought after one visit at night, when its flaws were hidden. Still, it was a much better place to die than in the Tulsi's house full of family. Even though Mr Biswas died with little more than a mortgaged house, at least he didn't die as one had been born, unnecessary and unaccommodated. In fact, Mr Biswas's birth was very bad. He was born at midnight, the worst time of day, with 6 fingers and the wrong way up. Pundit Sitaram told him that he would be a whore, a spendthrift, and a liar. He also told him that he would ruin his parents' lives and that he shouldn't go near trees or water. Even though he is given the name Mohun, the storyteller insists on calling him Mr Biswas from the very beginning. Raghu, his father, was a mean sugarcane worker who hid his money in jars and made Mr Biswas stay home from work whenever he sneezed out of superstition. While his older brothers Pratap and Prasad worked with their father in the cane fields, Mr Biswas was too sick and weak to work. That is, until his friend Dhari needed someone to take care of his new calf. While he was looking at a small stream, the calf walked off and drowned. Mr Biswas was too afraid to tell anyone, so he hid under his father's bed until the whole village gathered at the lake and Raghu started diving for the lost animal and boy. He got the dead calf out of the water, but he drowned while looking for Mr Biswas, just as the main character arrived. Neighbors were digging through Raghu's buried money jars in the family's yard at night, so Mr Biswas's mother, Bipti, chose to sell the land and move to her sister Tara's house in Pagodis. Mr Biswas was lucky enough to go to school in Pagodis, where he learned to read from the strict teacher Lal and made friends with Alec, who taught him how to draw beautiful letters. Mr Biswas chose to work with Alec painting signs after he was fired from his pundit position with Jairam and his job at a rum shop run by Tara's brother-in-law, Bandat. Mr Biswas painted signs, which led him to the beautiful Hanuman house of the Tulsis in the town of Arwakas. There, a scary man named Seth hired him to paint signs in the Tulsi store. Mr Biswas fell in love with Shama, a 16-year-old Tulsi daughter, right away and wrote her a love letter. But Mrs. Tulsi caught his note and, to his surprise, gave him Shama's hand in marriage right away. He took the job and quickly regretted it, but he still moved into a room on the 2nd floor of Hanuman House, where a lot of family members lived together in an uneasy but mostly peaceful way. Mr Biswas hated his new surroundings right away. He made enemies with as many Tulsis as he could, including Shama, Shama's sister Shinta, Shinta's husband Govind, a religious and traditional brother-in-law named Hari, and Mrs. Tulsi's 2 smart sons, whom she cared about a lot and who he called the 2 gods. After Mr Biswas spat on and threw food at Owed, the younger god, Govind gave him a good beating and told him to leave the house right away. After he was kicked out, Mr Biswas moved to a small town called the Chase to run a shop that the Tulsis had bought there. Shama was mad at him at first because he tried to paddle his own canoe and got them stuck in a tiny house in the middle of nowhere. But they started to find things they had in common, and she got pregnant quickly. Their daughter Savi was born soon after. But business was going downhill at the Chase, especially since Mr Biswas was ready to sell to the people of the town on credit. In the end, Mr Biswas lost all of his money when Mungru, a local thug who liked to fight with sticks, sued him for hurting his credit. With his whole family, Shama, Savi, and his new son, Anand, at Hanuman House and his sense of being alone at the chase growing, Mr. Biswas began to value the community he found among the Tulsis and Arwakas and let Seth talk him into insuring and burning down the store at the chase. The next place Mr. Biswas went was Green Vale, a farm near Arwakas where he worked as a supervisor for Seth's workers. His work was boring and his life at home, in a small room in a shared barracks, was very bad. The only thing that made him feel better was reading the newspapers that the person who lived there before him used as wallpaper. He started to dream of building his own house behind a grove of trees nearby. He tried to claim Savi from Hanuman House, but failed. After a nervous breakdown that ended with him striking Shama, he turned to Anand, who agreed to stay. He had already spent all of his money building a simple house out of recycled materials with the help of a local builder, Mr. George McLean. While they were living there, the father and son quickly discovered that they both liked books, philosophy, and science projects. But soon after Mr. Biswas's dog Tarzan died and was left on their porch, a bad lightning storm tore the house apart, leaving Mr. Biswas again without a place to live. The Tulsi brothers-in-law brought him and Anand back to Hanuman House, where he got better and started to feel safe and even a little adventurous, maybe for the first time in his life. Even though he was finally reunited with all of his children, including Mina and Kamla, his two new girls, Mr. Biswas left the house with a small bag and no idea where to go. Mr. Biswas hopped on a bus and went to Port of Spain, where he stayed with his sister Dehuti and her husband Ramchand in their shabby house on the edge of the city. He walked into the office of the Sentinel, a newspaper where an old friend from Arwakas had worked for a while. Even though it took him a day of free sign painting to convince the editor, Mr. Burnett, to let him try reporting, Mr. Biswas got a month's trial that he didn't get paid for. His first stories about dead babies were boring, but after Daddy Comes Home in a Coffin, Mr. Burnett was pleased, and Mr. Biswas became a full-time writer. Mr. Biswas's family agreed to move to Port of Spain, and Mrs. Tulsi offered them the extra rooms in her empty house there for only $8 a month. Soon, a new regime took over the Sentinel. Mr. Biswas was told to report, not distort, instead of writing dramatic stories. The bosses gave him only the most basic information about cricket games and court cases and then fired Mr. Burnett. As Mr. Biswas got more and more unhappy, his children started spending time with their relatives in the country, first with Tara and her husband Ajoda and then with the Tulsis at Hanuman House. Because of fights with Seth, the Tulsis suddenly chose to move from Hanuman House to a farm in Short Hills in the north of Trinidad, and Mr. Biswas's family was kicked out of Mrs. Tulsi's house in Port of Spain. Mr. Biswas moved in with the Tulsis again, but this time it didn't bother him as much, especially since Mrs. Tulsi was getting old and didn't care much about anything. But the beautiful farm started to get worse and worse, putting the family's life at risk. In the end, Mr. Biswas had to leave the house because he was accused of stealing. So he had his own house built nearby right away. Unfortunately, when the family tried to burn the brush around the new house, they ended up burning it down instead. But luckily, Mrs. Tulsi's home in Port of Spain became open again, and Mr. Biswas moved back there with Govind, Shinta, their children, all the Tuttles, and a widow named Badai. The three brothers-in-law fought all the time, but not directly. Govind and W.C. Tuttle both got rich working for the Americans during World War II, when they built military camps and oil infrastructure in Trinidad. Mr. Biswas started writing a piece for the Sentinel's Deserving Destitutes Fund. He visited poor people in Trinidad and picked one every day to win a sum of money. He did this before his mother Bipti died, and he was truly saddened by the love and connection he felt he never had with her. Anand was one of the best students at his school. He beat his cousin Vidyadhar in a competition by getting a scholarship to the local college. When Anand went to college, Mr. Biswas got a new job doing surveys for the Community Welfare Department under the beautiful and eager Miss Logie. Just as Mr. Biswas was starting to feel like the most important brother-in-law, he found out that W.C. Tuttle had bought a house across town and that Mrs. Tulsi was moving back to get ready for Owad's return from England. When Owad moved in, he quickly took charge of the family. His stories about medical adventures and politics in England and Russia won everyone's attention and respect. He soon turned Anand and Mr. Biswas against him, and Mrs. Tulsi made the Biswases leave. One day, a worker at a lawyer's office told Mr. Biswas about a house the lawyer was trying to sell. It was the same house where the main character died in the prologue. Mr. Biswas finally talked himself into getting it, and he borrowed more than $4,000 from a Jodha to pay for it. He moved his family into the new house, only to find out that the solicitor's clerk had built it badly and that it was much worse than other houses in the area that were the same price. In the conclusion, the last 5 years of Mr. Biswas's life are summed up. Anand and Savi went to college abroad. Mr. Biswas finally learned to accept Shama's sense of reason, and he had 2 heart attacks that put him in the hospital and made him unable to move around. When Savi got back from college and found a job that paid much more than he had ever made, Mr. Biswas, who was a firm atheist, asked him, "How can you not believe in God after this?" He died soon after, and family from all over Trinidad came to his funeral and ashes before going back to their own homes.
About the author. Naipaul was born in the country of Trinidad. His grandparents were slaves from South Asia who were forced to work on sugarcane farms in Trinidad. His father was the writer V.S.Naipaul, who inspired the character of Mr. Biswas. His mother was from the well-known Capildio family, which inspired the story's Tulsi family. At age 6, he moved from the country to Port of Spain. He went to the best secondary school in Trinidad and got a scholarship to Oxford, where he felt out of place and had what he called a nervous breakdown. Still, Naipaul spent the rest of his life in England. He graduated in 1953, the same year that his father died. In 1955, he married Patricia Hale, a friend from Oxford. At the time, he was living in London and writing his first novel, The Mystic Masseur, and his first collection of short stories, Miguel Street. But he didn't become famous as a writer until A House for Mr. Biswas came out in 1961. Soon after, he started writing non-fiction and published trip books about the Caribbean, the Middle Passage, and India, an area of darkness, before going back to London popular but broke. Later, he went on long trips to East Africa, Argentina, where he began a decades-long affair with Margaret Gooding, Indonesia, Iran, and Pakistan, where, in 1996, as his first wife Patricia Hale was dying of cancer in a London hospital, he decided to leave his mistress Gooding and marry a journalist he had just met, Nadira Alvi. He spent the rest of his life in a house in the English countryside. He wrote more than a dozen stories and about the same number of non-fiction books. He was made a knight in 1990, and the Swedish Academy gave him the Nobel Prize in Literature in 2001 for having united perceptive narrative and incorruptible scrutiny in works that force us to see the presence of suppressed histories. Even though Naipaul was well known around the world, he often got harsh criticism for his gloom, the way he treated women, and especially the way his writing criticized non-European people and countries, including Trinidad.
Hope we summarized it fully and you liked it. Please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel so that we are motivated to create more videos.